October 23rd, 1959. The cafeteria went silent. Then, it erupted. But let me back up 10 seconds. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Lunchtime. 250 of America's most dangerous men crammed into a concrete room that smelled like industrial cleaner and fear. Metal trays, scraping, quiet conversations. Guards posted at every corner, batons ready, eyes scanning for trouble. At table 14, near the back wall, sat Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, 54 years old, 7 years deep into a 15-year sentence. A Harlem legend who once controlled millions in illegal gambling and made Italian mobsters think twice before stepping into his territory. Inside Alcatraz, he was respected, feared by some, but never challenged. Until today, Eric Polson slid into the seat directly across from him, 6'4", 260 pounds of muscle, rage, and hate. Polson had been kicked out of 3 federal prisons before landing on the Rock, not because he was smart, because he was violent, openly racist, and proud of it. For weeks, Polson had been testing Bumpy, stealing his food, shoving him in the showers, blocking his path in the yard. Each time, Bumpy said nothing. To the other inmates, it looked like patience. To Polson, it looked like weakness. So he got bolder. Polson leaned forward. His voice was loud enough for the whole table to hear. "You think you're somebody in here, don't you?" Bumpy didn't look up. He kept eating, slow, deliberate, like Polson wasn't even worth acknowledging. That made Polson angrier. He slammed his fist on the table. Trays rattled, heads turned, guards shifted their weight, hands moving closer to their belts. Then Polson said it. A slur so vile, so loaded with contempt, that even the white inmates at nearby tables flinched. Still, Bumpy didn't move. But then Polson made his mistake. He turned to a younger black inmate sitting 2 seats down. A kid, really, maybe 23, skinny, quiet, the kind of guy who kept his head down and prayed his sentence would end without incident. Polson pointed at him. "You're next," he said. "After I'm done with this old man, I'm coming for you." That's when everything changed. Bumpy's fork stopped midair. His jaw tightened, his eyes calm, calculating, ice cold, locked onto Polson. And then he stood. The cafeteria froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered over trays. 250 inmates collectively held their breath because they knew everyone knew what was about to happen. The guards saw it too. One of them started moving toward table 14, but he was too far away, too slow. Bumpy didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Polson realized his mistake exactly 1 second too late. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds. But those 10 seconds ended weeks of terror, shifted the racial power balance inside Alcatraz overnight, and turned Bumpy Johnson from a respected inmate into an untouchable legend. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that subscribe button. You're about to hear one of the most calculated acts of justice in prison history. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Because what Bumpy did wasn't about rage. It wasn't random violence. It was about timing, control, and sending a message that would echo through the Rock for years to come. On Alcatraz, where escape was impossible and violence was currency, this moment became legendary. For one reason, it ended something. To understand what happened in that cafeteria, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was long before he ever set foot on Alcatraz. Because this wasn't just another inmate losing his temper. This was a man who had spent decades mastering the art of power, patience, and calculated violence in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America, Harlem. 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds. If you controlled Harlem's underworld during that era, you controlled millions. Illegal gambling, numbers, rackets, protection schemes. It was a cash empire built on risk, reputation, and the ability to outthink your enemies before they even knew you were coming. Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive in that world. He dominated it. Born in South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy moved to Harlem as a teenager and quickly realized the streets had their own rules. You either learned them fast or you disappeared. He learned them, then he rewrote them. By his mid-20s, Bumpy was already making a name for himself. Not because he was the biggest or the loudest, but because he was smart, strategic. He understood something most street criminals didn't. Violence without purpose is just chaos. But violence with precision, that's power. He became the right-hand man to Stephanie Street Claire, the infamous Queen of Numbers, who ran Harlem's lottery rackets. When the Italian mob led by Charles Lucky Luciano and the Genovese crime family tried to muscle in on her territory, most people expected her operation to collapse. It didn't, because Bumpy Johnson stood in their way. He went toe-to-toe with some of the most feared mobsters in New York, not by starting wars he couldn't win, but by making it clear that taking Harlem would cost more than it was worth. He negotiated, he strategized, and when negotiation failed, he acted with surgical precision. The Italians respected him for it. That alone tells you everything. In a world where black criminals were often dismissed, underestimated, or outright erased by more powerful white crime families, Bumpy earned a seat at the table. Not because anyone gave it to him, because he took it. By the 1,940 seconds, Bumpy was a millionaire. He controlled gambling operations across Harlem, employed hundreds of people, and had connections that reached from street corners to City Hall. Politicians knew his name. Cops looked the other way, or got paid to. And in the neighborhood, he was more than a gangster. He was a protector. Bumpy had a code. He didn't tolerate drugs in his territory. He didn't prey on working people. And if someone in Harlem needed help rent money, protection from crooked landlords, a way out of trouble, Bumpy often stepped in. That's why, even decades after his death, old-timers in Harlem still speak his name with respect. But power like that doesn't last forever. In 1951, federal agents finally caught up with him. Conspiracy charges, drug trafficking, the kind of case the government builds when they can't nail you for what you actually did. So they throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years. And in 1953, at the age of 48, he was transferred to the one place the federal government sent men they wanted to forget. Alcatraz, the Rock, America's most infamous prison. Built on an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing water and currents strong enough to drown Olympic swimmers. Escape was impossible. The guards were brutal. The inmates were worse. Most men arrived at Alcatraz broken, terrified, desperate to survive. Bumpy Johnson arrived like he owned the place. Not arrogant, not loud, but with the kind of quiet confidence that made even the most hardened criminals take notice. He didn't need to prove himself. His reputation had arrived before he did. Inside Alcatraz, respect wasn't given, it was earned. And Bumpy earned it the same way he had in Harlem, by being smart, staying calm, and never abusing his influence. He didn't start fights. He didn't join gangs. He didn't play the usual prison politics games, but everyone knew, if you crossed Bumpy Johnson, there would be consequences. For 7 years, he moved through Alcatraz like a ghost. Respected by black inmates, acknowledged by white ones, even some of the guards gave him a wide berth, because they understood that men like Bumpy didn't need to cause trouble to be dangerous. But respect, especially in a place like Alcatraz, can make you a target, because there's always someone who sees your reputation as a challenge. Someone who thinks tearing you down will build them up. Someone like Eric Polson. Polson didn't care about Bumpy's history. Didn't care that he'd gone head-to-head with the Italian mob and lived to tell about it. Didn't care that Bumpy had more intelligence in his pinky finger than Polson had in his entire body. All Polson saw was a black man getting respect, and that, to him, was unacceptable. So he decided to test Bumpy, to see if the legend was real, to prove at least to himself that Bumpy Johnson was just another old man who'd lost his edge. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison, it was a message. The federal government built it to hold men they couldn't break anywhere else. Men who'd escaped from other facilities, men who'd killed guards, men whose influence reached beyond prison walls and threatened to turn entire cell blocks into criminal empires. If you ended up on Alcatraz, it meant every other option had failed. The island sat in the middle of San Francisco Bay, 1.5 miles from the mainland. Close enough to see the city lights at night. Far enough that it might as well have been another planet. The water surrounding the island stayed between 50 and 55 degrees year-round, cold enough to kill you in minutes if hypothermia didn't get you first. The currents were vicious, strong enough to pull a grown man under before he could scream for help. 23 men tried to escape Alcatraz over the years. Most drowned. The rest were shot or recaptured. None made it to freedom. At least, none that anyone could prove. Inside the prison, life was designed to break you slowly. 250 inmates. 540 cells, most of them empty. Because Alcatraz didn't need to be full to be effective. It just needed to be brutal. Cells were 5 feet by 9 feet, a cot, a sink, a toilet, no privacy, no comfort. Lights out at 9:30 p.m., wake up at 6:30 a.m., every day, for years. You got 4 rights at Alcatraz: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else, visits, letters, recreation time, had to be earned. The guards were handpicked, former military, men who didn't flinch at violence and didn't tolerate disrespect. They carried batons, not guns, because the warden didn't want inmates getting their hands on firearms during a riot. But make no mistake, the guards had backup: sharpshooters in towers, tear gas canisters, reinforced steel doors that could lock down entire sections of the prison in seconds. If you caused trouble, you went to the hole. Solitary confinement, a windowless cell where you sat in darkness for days, sometimes weeks, with nothing but your thoughts and the sound of your own breathing. Most men came out of the hole different, quieter, broken. But the worst part of Alcatraz wasn't the isolation or the cold or the guards. It was the other inmates. Because the federal government didn't just send dangerous men to the rock. They sent men who were dangerous and smart. Men who understood power. Men who knew how to manipulate, intimidate, and control without ever throwing a punch. And in the 1,950 seconds, race was the fault line that divided everything. America was still years away from the Civil Rights Act. Segregation was the law in most of the country. Inside Alcatraz, that tension didn't disappear. It intensified. Black inmates and white inmates didn't mix unless they had to. Meals were segregated by choice, not rule. The yard had invisible boundaries everyone understood. Cross them, and you were asking for trouble. The guards didn't stop it. Some of them encouraged it. Because a divided prison was easier to control than a united one. In that environment, respect was everything. If you were weak, you got preyed on. If you were loud, you got targeted. If you were smart and kept your head down, you might survive your sentence without major incident. But if you were respected, truly respected, you had something more valuable than protection. You had influence. Bumpy Johnson had that influence. He didn't run a gang, didn't control contraband, didn't play the usual power games. But when he walked into the yard, men noticed. When he sat down at a table, conversations shifted. When he spoke, people listened. That kind of respect didn't come from fear. It came from reputation. From the understanding that Bumpy had survived decades in a world more dangerous than Alcatraz and come out on top. Black inmates looked up to him because he represented something they rarely saw inside those walls: dignity. White inmates respected him because he didn't need to prove anything. He just was. But respect, especially across racial lines, made some people uncomfortable. It disrupted the natural order. It suggested that maybe the hierarchy inside Alcatraz wasn't as fixed as everyone thought. And for men like Eric Polson, men whose entire identity was built on the belief that they were superior simply because of the color of their skin that was intolerable. Polson had been inside Alcatraz for 3 years by the time Bumpy crossed his radar. 3 years of watching a black man command respect that Polson thought should have been his. 3 years of resentment building. 3 years of waiting for the right moment to tear Bumpy down. He thought that moment had finally come. He was wrong. Eric Polson wasn't born on Alcatraz, but he was built for it. 6'4", 260 pounds, a body shaped by years of prison yard workouts, and a mind warped by hate. By the time he arrived on the Rock in 1956, he'd already been kicked out of 3 federal prisons. Not for escaping, not for organizing, for being uncontrollable. Polson had a pattern. He'd arrive at a new facility, size up the weakest inmates, and start testing boundaries. A shove here, a stolen meal there, whispered threats in the showers where guards couldn't hear. He was smart enough to stay just below the line that would get him thrown in solitary, but brutal enough that everyone knew what he was capable of. At Leavenworth, he'd put 2 men in the infirmary within his first 6 months. At Atlanta, he'd started a race riot that left a dozen inmates injured and 3 guards hospitalized. At Marion, he'd beaten a man so badly that the warden personally requested his transfer. The federal government didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to the one place designed for men no one else wanted. Alcatraz didn't fix Polson. It just gave him a smaller pond to terrorize, and his favorite targets were always the same: Black inmates. Polson wasn't just violent. He was a true believer. The kind of racist who thought his skin color made him superior by default. The kind who saw black men as beneath him, unworthy of respect, and certainly unworthy of the kind of influence Bumpy Johnson had. Inside Alcatraz, Polson developed a system. He never attacked anyone outright. That would have gotten him locked down immediately. Instead, he harassed, intimidated, pushed boundaries just enough to make life miserable for his targets without giving the guards a clear reason to intervene. He'd walk up to a black inmate in the chow line and cut in front of him. If the man protested, Polson would stare him down until he backed off. He'd accidentally bump into someone in the yard, hard enough to knock them off balance, then laugh when they stumbled. He'd sit at tables where he wasn't welcome and take food off other men's trays, not because he was hungry, because he could. And the worst part? He usually got away with it. The guards saw what was happening. They weren't blind, but Polson was careful. He never crossed the line into outright violence where they could justify punishment. And some of the guards, not all, but enough, didn't particularly care if a racist white inmate made life harder for black prisoners. So Polson kept pushing. For 3 years, he moved through Alcatraz like a predator, picking off the vulnerable, the isolated, the men who didn't have backup. And then he noticed Bumpy Johnson. At first, Polson didn't understand it. Here was a black man, 54 years old, not particularly big, not particularly loud, who somehow commanded more respect than Polson ever had. Inmates of all races acknowledged Bumpy, spoke to him with deference, gave him space in the yard without being asked. To Polson, that was an insult. How could a black man have that kind of standing? How could someone Polson saw as inferior be treated like royalty, while he had to fight for every scrap of respect? It ate at him. So he decided to test Bumpy the same way he'd tested everyone else. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. It helps more people discover these untold moments. What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. The first incident happened in the chow line. Polson cut in front of Bumpy, grabbed his tray, and took the better portion of food. Bumpy said nothing, just grabbed another tray and kept moving. Polson smirked. He thought he'd won. The second incident happened in the showers. Polson shoved Bumpy hard enough that he had to catch himself against the wall. Again, Bumpy said nothing, just finished washing and walked out. Polson's smirk grew wider. The third incident happened in the yard. Polson deliberately blocked Bumpy's path, forcing him to step around. Still, Bumpy didn't react. To the other inmates watching, it was confusing. This was Bumpy Johnson, a man who'd gone head-to-head with the Italian mob and lived to tell about it. Why wasn't he responding? But a few of the older inmates understood. Bumpy wasn't scared. He was waiting. Because inside Alcatraz, timing mattered more than strength. If Bumpy reacted too soon, he'd be the one punished. The guards would see him as the aggressor. He'd lose the respect he'd spent 7 years building. But if Polson kept escalating, and men like Polson always did, eventually he'd cross a line that justified a response the guards couldn't ignore, a response that would end this, once and for all. Polson didn't understand that. He thought Bumpy's silence meant weakness, so he kept pushing, and pushing, and pushing, until he finally pushed too far. The harassment didn't happen all at once. It was slow, deliberate, a campaign of intimidation designed to break Bumpy Johnson down piece by piece. Polson had done this before. He knew how it worked. You didn't attack a man outright that got you thrown in the hole. You chipped away at him, made him feel small, made him question whether fighting back was worth the consequences. Most men cracked eventually. Polson was betting Bumpy would too. He was wrong. Incident 1. The chow line. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September 1959. Breakfast at Alcatraz was the same every day. Oatmeal, stale bread, weak coffee, the kind of meal designed to keep you alive, not satisfied. Bumpy was halfway through the line when Polson cut in front of him. Not by accident, not in a rush. Deliberately, he stepped in front of Bumpy, grabbed his tray, and took the portion with the most food. Then he turned, looked Bumpy dead in the eye, and smiled. The inmates behind them tensed. A few guards glanced over, but didn't move. Technically, Polson hadn't done anything they could write up. He'd just cut in line. Bumpy stood there for a moment. His face didn't change. No anger, no frustration, nothing. He just grabbed another tray and kept moving. Polson laughed. loud enough for everyone to hear. To him, it was confirmation. Bumpy Johnson, the so-called legend, was just another old man who didn't have it in him anymore, but the older inmates knew better. One of them, a lifer named Marcus, who'd been on the rock for 11 years, leaned over to another inmate and whispered, "Polson just made a mistake." "How?" "Bumpy didn't do nothing." "Exactly," Marcus said. "That's how you know he's thinking." Incident 2. The showers. 3 days later, it happened again. The showers at Alcatraz were communal. No privacy, no doors, just a row of rusted shower heads bolted to a concrete wall. You washed fast, kept your head down, and got out. Bumpy was rinsing soap off his shoulders when Polson walked up behind him. No warning, just a hard shove between the shoulder blades. Bumpy stumbled forward, catching himself against the wall before he hit the ground. Water sprayed across his face. His hands slapped against the wet concrete. Polson stood there, arms crossed, grinning. "Slippery in here, old man. Gotta watch your step." A few other inmates froze mid-wash, waiting to see what Bumpy would do. He stood up slowly, water dripping off his face, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Polson for just a second. Then he turned, finished rinsing, and walked out. No words, no retaliation. Polson's grin widened, but Marcus, who'd been washing 2 shower heads down, shook his head. "He's counting," Marcus muttered to himself. "Bumpy's counting, every single one." Incident 3. The yard. A week later, the harassment escalated again. Recreation time at Alcatraz was 1 hour a day. Inmates could walk the yard, lift weights, play cards, or just sit and stare at the San Francisco skyline in the distance. Bumpy usually spent his time walking the perimeter, alone, quiet, thinking. Polson decided to interrupt that. Bumpy was halfway around the yard when Polson stepped directly into his path. No reason, no excuse, just blocking him. Bumpy stopped, looked up at Polson, who stood a full 6 inches taller and had at least 50 pounds on him. "You got somewhere to be, old man." Bumpy didn't answer. Polson leaned in closer. "I asked you a question." Still nothing. The yard went quiet. Inmates stopped what they were doing. Guards shifted their positions, hands moving toward their batons. For a moment, it looked like Bumpy might swing, but he didn't. He just stepped to the side and walked around Polson like he was a piece of furniture. Polson turned and watched him go, laughing loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "That's what I thought." A few of the white inmates laughed with him, but most of the black inmates didn't. They just watched Bumpy walk away, their faces unreadable. One of them, a younger guy named Terrell, turned to Marcus. "Why doesn't he do something? Everyone knows Bumpy could handle Polson if he wanted to." Marcus lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly. "Because Bumpy's not stupid. Polson wants him to swing first. Wants him to be the aggressor so the guards have a reason to lock him down. But Bumpy's been playing this game longer than Polson's been alive. He knows how it works. So what's he waiting for?" Marcus flicked ash onto the concrete. "For Polson to give him a reason the guards can't ignore." The shift. By mid-October, the harassment had become routine. Polson stole Bumpy's food at least twice a week, shoved him in the showers whenever he got the chance, blocked his path in the yard just to watch him step aside. And every single time, Bumpy said nothing. To the untrained eye, it looked like weakness, like Bumpy had lost his edge, like the legend was just a story old men told to feel important. But inside Alcatraz, the smart inmates understood what was really happening. Bumpy wasn't scared. He was waiting for Polson to cross the line, waiting for the moment when a response wouldn't just be justified, it would be expected. Because in prison, reputation is everything. And if you act too soon, you lose it. But if you wait too long, you lose it too. Bumpy was walking a tightrope. And Polson, in his arrogance, didn't even realize he was the one about to fall. The line gets crossed. Then, in the 3rd week of October, something changed. Polson got bored with Bumpy. Or maybe he realized Bumpy wasn't going to break. Either way, he started looking for a new target. And he found one. A young black inmate named David, 23 years old, skinny, quiet, serving a 5-year sentence for a robbery he swore he didn't commit. David kept his head down, didn't cause trouble, didn't talk much, just wanted to do his time and get out. Polson saw him as easy prey. It started small. Polson took David's food, shoved him in the showers, whispered threats when the guards weren't looking. David didn't fight back. He was too scared, but Bumpy noticed. And for the first time in weeks, his expression changed. Because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about protection. And that was a line Bumpy Johnson would never let anyone cross. October 22nd, 1959, the day before everything changed. David was sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria, trying to make himself invisible. It was a survival tactic he'd learned early. Don't make eye contact. Don't draw attention. Don't give anyone a reason to notice you. But Polson noticed him anyway. He walked over to David's table, grabbed his tray, and dumped half the food onto his own plate. David didn't say a word, just stared down at what was left. Polson leaned in close, his voice low enough that the guards couldn't hear. "You got a problem?" David shook his head quickly. "No, no problem. Good. Because tomorrow, I'm taking all of it. And if you say anything, I'm gonna make sure you regret it." Then Polson walked away, laughing. David sat there, hands shaking, staring at his half-empty tray. He didn't notice Bumpy watching from 3 tables over, but Bumpy saw everything. That night, in his cell, Bumpy lay on his cot staring at the ceiling. For weeks, he'd tolerated Polson's harassment because it was personal. Polson wanted to test him, to see if the legend was real. That was prison politics. That was the game. But this was different. David wasn't a player. He wasn't part of the power structure. He was just a kid trying to survive. And Polson was targeting him for the same reason predators always target the weak, because he could. Bumpy had seen this before. In Harlem, in other prisons, in every place where power went unchecked. If no one stopped Polson now, David wouldn't be his last victim. There would be others. More threats, more fear. More young men too scared to eat, too scared to sleep, too scared to do anything but count down the days until their sentence ended. Bumpy had a choice to make. He could keep his head down, finish his sentence quietly, stay out of trouble, and walk out of Alcatraz in 8 years with his record clean. Or he could do what he'd always done, protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. The decision wasn't hard. It never had been. The next morning, October 23rd, Bumpy woke up with a plan. He didn't tell anyone, didn't ask for backup, didn't make a big show of it. He just knew that today, one way or another, the harassment was going to end. Breakfast came and went, without incident. Polson was in a good mood, laughing with a few other white inmates, probably already planning what he was going to do to David at lunch. Morning work detail passed slowly. Bumpy worked in the laundry, folding sheets, keeping his head down, staying quiet, but the other inmates noticed something different about him. Marcus, who worked 2 stations over, caught Bumpy's eye and nodded slightly. He knew. Somehow, without a word being spoken, Marcus knew that today was the day. Lunchtime. The cafeteria filled up like it always did. 250 men shuffling in, grabbing trays, finding seats. Guards posted at every corner, watching for trouble. Bumpy got his food and sat down at his usual table. A few other black inmates joined him. They didn't talk much, just ate. Then Polson walked in. He scanned the room, spotted David sitting alone near the back, and smiled. But instead of going straight for David, Polson did something unexpected. He walked over to Bumpy's table and sat down. Right across from him, the inmates at the table tensed. A few of them glanced at Bumpy, waiting for a signal. Bumpy kept eating, calm, unbothered. Polson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning like he'd already won. "You know what I've been thinking, old man?" Bumpy didn't look up. "I've been thinking you're not as tough as everyone says. I've been pushing you around for weeks, and you haven't done a damn thing about it." Still nothing from Bumpy. Polson's grin faded. He leaned forward, his voice getting louder. "You think you're somebody in here, don't you? You think because you ran some numbers game in Harlem 30 years ago, that makes you special?" Bumpy took another bite of food, chewed slowly, swallowed. Polson slammed his fist on the table. Trays rattled. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The guards noticed. One of them started moving toward the table, but he was still 20 feet away. Polson's face twisted with rage. And then he said it. A slur so vicious, so loaded with hate, that even the white inmates at nearby tables went silent. Bumpy's fork stopped midair, but he still didn't look up. Polson wasn't done. He turned in his seat and pointed directly at David, who was sitting 2 tables over, frozen in fear. "You see that kid over there? After I'm done with you, I'm going after him. And there's nothing you or anyone else can do about it." That was the moment. "Don't go anywhere. What happens next changed Alcatraz forever. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss stories like this. What's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know. Bumpy's jaw tightened. His eyes calm, cold, calculating, lifted from his tray and locked onto Polson. And then he stood. The cafeteria went dead silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. 250 inmates held their breath because everyone knew what was about to happen. Polson realized it too. But by then, it was too late. He'd spent weeks pushing Bumpy, testing him, trying to break him, and now, in front of the entire prison, he was about to find out what happened when you pushed Bumpy Johnson too far. Bumpy didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Polson tried to stand, tried to get his hands up, tried to prepare himself, but Bumpy had been preparing for weeks. And when he moved, it was with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime knowing exactly when and how to strike. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds would be talked about on the rock for years. Bumpy Johnson stood, and the world stopped. For a single, frozen moment, the cafeteria existed in perfect silence. No clattering trays, no shuffling feet, no whispered conversations. Just 250 men watching, waiting. Polson was still sitting. His finger pointed at David, his mouth twisted into a sneer. He'd been so focused on the threat, so confident in his intimidation, that he didn't register the danger until it was too late. By the time he turned back toward Bumpy, Bumpy was already moving. Not rushing, not wild, not out of control. Calculated. Polson tried to stand, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. His hands came up instinctively, but they were too slow. Bumpy's first move wasn't a punch. It was a grip. He grabbed the front of Polson's shirt with his left hand, yanking him forward off balance. Polson's eyes went wide, not with fear yet, but with surprise. He outweighed Bumpy by 50 pounds. He was younger, stronger, but none of that mattered, because Bumpy wasn't fighting with strength. He was fighting with 50 years of experience. Polson swung wildly, a haymaker aimed at Bumpy's head. It was the kind of punch that would have knocked out most men if it connected. It didn't connect. Bumpy ducked under it, stepped inside Polson's reach, and drove his right fist into Polson's ribs. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. The sound echoed through the cafeteria like gunshots. Polson gasped, the air rushing out of his lungs. He tried to grab Bumpy, tried to use his size to wrestle him down, but Bumpy was already moving again. He pivoted, using Polson's own momentum against him, and slammed him face first into the table. The metal tray clattered to the floor. Food splattered across the concrete. Polson's nose exploded on impact. Blood sprayed across the table, across Bumpy's hands, across the floor. The inmates closest to the fight scrambled backward, chairs scraping, men shouting. The guards were moving now, batons out, boots pounding against the floor, but they were still 15 feet away. Polson tried to push himself up, blood pouring from his nose, his vision blurred. He was dazed but not done. He swung again, this time catching Bumpy on the shoulder. It was a glancing blow, barely enough to register. Bumpy didn't even flinch. He grabbed Polson by the back of the head and slammed him into the table again, and again, and again. Each impact was deliberate, controlled, not the wild flailing of a man who'd lost his temper. This was precision. This was a message. Polson's legs buckled. He slumped against the table, barely conscious, blood pooling beneath his face. Bumpy stepped back. His breathing was steady. His hands were covered in blood, Polson's blood, but his expression hadn't changed. Calm, cold, unbothered. The guards reached him a second later. On the ground. Now. Bumpy didn't resist. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, and dropped to his knees. 2 guards grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back, snapping cuffs onto his wrists. A 3rd guard rushed to Polson, who was still slumped over the table, groaning, barely conscious. Get the medic, now. The cafeteria was chaos now. Inmates shouting, guards yelling orders, chairs overturned, trays scattered across the floor. But through it all, Bumpy stayed silent. He didn't struggle, didn't protest, didn't say a word. He just let them cuff him and pull him to his feet. As the guards dragged him toward the exit, Bumpy's eyes swept across the cafeteria one last time. He saw David, still sitting at his table, staring in shock. He saw Marcus, nodding slowly, a faint smile on his face. He saw the other black inmates, their expressions a mix of awe and respect. And he saw Polson, being lifted onto a stretcher, his face a bloody mess, his reputation shattered. The message had been sent, and everyone in that cafeteria had received it. The aftermath, immediate. They took Bumpy straight to solitary confinement. The hole, a windowless cell, 6 feet by 8 feet. No bed, no sink, just a concrete floor, a bucket, and darkness. The door slammed shut behind him, and the lock clicked into place. Bumpy sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, and exhaled slowly. His hands were still covered in blood. His knuckles were bruised. His shoulder ached where Polson had landed that one weak punch. But he felt no regret, not for what he'd done, not for the consequences he knew were coming, because it had been worth it. Outside, in the cafeteria, the guards were still trying to restore order. Polson had been carried out on a stretcher, barely conscious, his face swollen and broken. The medic said his nose was shattered. His jaw might be fractured. He'd need stitches. Maybe surgery. But he'd live. The warden arrived 10 minutes later, his face tight with anger. What the hell happened? One of the guards, a veteran named Thompson who'd been at Alcatraz for 12 years, stepped forward. Polson provoked him, sir. Multiple witnesses confirm it. I don't care who provoked who. Johnson put a man in the infirmary. That's assault. That's... Sir, Thompson interrupted, which almost never happened. With all due respect, you need to hear what the witnesses are saying. The warden's jaw clenched. Fine. Start interviewing them. I want statements from everyone who saw what happened. The interviews. Over the next 3 hours, guards interviewed 27 inmates who'd been in the cafeteria. 27 different men. And every single one of them told the same story. Polson had been harassing Bumpy for weeks. Polson had sat down at Bumpy's table uninvited. Polson had used racial slurs. Polson had threatened a younger inmate. And Bumpy had responded. Not randomly. Not out of nowhere, but after weeks of provocation and a direct threat to someone who couldn't defend himself. One inmate, a white guy named Sullivan, who'd been sitting 2 tables over, put it bluntly, Polson had it coming. Everyone knew it. He's been terrorizing people for years, and nobody did anything about it. Johnson did what the guards should have done a long time ago. Another inmate, Marcus, was even more direct. You want to know what happened? Polson thought he could push a man like Bumpy Johnson around because of the color of his skin. He thought wrong. That's what happened. Even some of the white inmates who'd laughed along with Polson's harassment admitted the truth. Yeah, Polson was out of line. He wouldn't shut up, kept pushing and pushing. Johnson gave him plenty of chances to walk away. By the time the interviews were done, the warden had a problem. Because the evidence was clear. Bumpy had assaulted another inmate. That was a fact. But Polson had provoked it, repeatedly, publicly, and in a way that made it impossible to ignore. If the warden came down too hard on Bumpy, he risked a riot. The black inmates would see it as proof that the system protected racists and punished anyone who stood up to them. But if he didn't punish Bumpy at all, he'd lose control of the prison entirely. It was a no-win situation, and everyone knew it. Polson's fall. Meanwhile, in the infirmary, Polson was coming to. His face was wrapped in bandages. His nose was broken. His jaw was wired shut. He could barely see through the swelling around his eyes. But the physical damage wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he saw in the eyes of the guards standing watch. Not sympathy. Not concern. Pity. Because everyone knew what had just happened. Polson had spent 3 years building a reputation as the toughest, most feared inmate on the rock. And Bumpy Johnson had destroyed it in 10 seconds. Polson would recover physically, eventually, but his reputation, that was gone forever. Back in solitary, Bumpy sat in the darkness, his breathing slow and steady. He knew what was coming. More time in the hole, maybe additional charges, maybe more years added to his sentence. But none of that mattered, because the harassment had stopped. David was safe. And every inmate on Alcatraz now understood one simple truth. You could test Bumpy Johnson, but you couldn't break him. Bumpy Johnson spent 14 days in solitary confinement, 14 days in a 6 by 8 foot concrete box with no windows, no light, and no human contact except for the guard, who slid a tray of food through the slot in the door, twice a day. Most men came out of the hole broken, paranoid, talking to themselves. Bumpy came out the same way he went in, calm, focused, unshaken. The warden had a decision to make, And it wasn't an easy one. Technically, Bumpy had committed assault. The rules were clear. Violence against another inmate meant punishment, additional time in solitary, loss of privileges, possibly even additional charges that could extend his sentence. But the warden also had 27 witness statements sitting on his desk. 27 inmates, black, white, didn't matter, all saying the same thing. Polson provoked it. Polson had been harassing Bumpy for weeks. Polson had used racial slurs in front of dozens of witnesses. Polson had threatened a younger inmate who had nothing to do with their conflict. And Bumpy had responded. Not randomly, not as the aggressor, but as someone who'd been pushed past the point where silence was an option. The warden knew that if he came down too hard on Bumpy, he'd have a bigger problem on his hands. The black inmates would see it as proof that the system protected racists and punished anyone who stood up to them. Tensions were already high. A riot wasn't out of the question. But if he didn't punish Bumpy at all, he'd lose control of the entire prison. Inmates would think they could settle their own scores without consequences. So the warden did what wardens always do when they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. He split the difference. Bumpy's 14 days in solitary would stand. That was the punishment. But there would be no additional charges, no extended sentence, no permanent mark on his record beyond what had already happened. Officially, the incident would be classified as mutual combat with provocation. Unofficially, everyone knew what it really was: justice. When Bumpy was released from solitary and returned to general population, the prison had changed. Not physically. The walls were still the same, the cells were still the same, the guards were still the same. But the atmosphere was different. The first time Bumpy walked into the cafeteria, conversation stopped. Inmates turned to look, not with fear, not with hostility, with respect. He got his tray, sat down at his usual table, and started eating. Within seconds, other inmates joined him. Black inmates, a few white inmates, even a couple of guys who'd never spoken to him before. Nobody said much. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything. Across the cafeteria, at a table near the back, Polson sat alone. His face was still bandaged. His nose was crooked now, permanently broken. His jaw had healed, but he still had trouble chewing solid food. But the physical damage wasn't what had changed him. It was the way people looked at him now. Or rather, the way they didn't. Before the fight, Polson had commanded attention. When he walked into a room, people noticed. When he sat down at a table, conversations shifted. When he spoke, people listened out of fear, if nothing else. Now, he was invisible. Inmates walked past him without a glance. Guards didn't bother watching him as closely. Even the white inmates who used to laugh at his jokes had moved on. Polson had spent 3 years building a reputation as the most feared man on the rock. Bumpy had destroyed it in 10 seconds, and everyone knew it. The harassment stopped, not just against Bumpy, not just against David, against everyone. The younger black inmates who'd been targets before, Polson didn't even look at them anymore. The vulnerable guys who used to get their food stolen, their paths blocked, their space invaded, nobody touched them, because the message had been sent, loud and clear. There were consequences now. David, the young inmate Polson had threatened, approached Bumpy one afternoon in the yard. He was nervous, hands in his pockets, eyes down. "Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy stopped walking and turned. I wanted to say thank you for what you did. I know it cost you." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You don't owe me anything. Just finish your sentence and get out of here. Don't come back." David nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I won't." He started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "Can I ask you something?" Bumpy waited. "Why'd you do it? You could have just ignored him. You only had 8 years left. Now you've got a mark on your record. Why risk it?" Bumpy was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the yard, watching the other inmates move through their routines. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Because some things are more important than time. You let a man like Polson run wild, and he doesn't stop with one person. He keeps going, keeps taking, keeps hurting. Somebody had to stop him. But why you?" Bumpy looked at David, and for the first time, there was something almost like a smile on his face. "Because I could." Over the next few weeks, the story of what happened in the cafeteria spread beyond Alcatraz. Inmates transferred to other prisons carried the story with them. Guards talked about it during shift changes. Even a few reporters caught wind of it, though the official records were sealed. But inside the rock, the story became legend, not because of the violence, but because of what it represented: control, timing, purpose. Bumpy Johnson had spent weeks being harassed, humiliated, and tested, and he'd waited until the moment was right. Waited until the provocation was undeniable. Waited until acting wasn't just justified, it was necessary. And when he finally moved, he didn't just win a fight, he ended a reign of terror. Polson never harassed another inmate again. Not because he couldn't, because he knew what would happen if he did. And Bumpy Johnson's legend inside Alcatraz became permanent. Not because he was the biggest, not because he was the loudest, but because when it mattered most, he stood up. And he finished it. The fight in the cafeteria didn't just change Bumpy Johnson's standing inside Alcatraz. It changed the entire prison. Within days, the racial power dynamics that had defined the Rock for years began to shift. Before October 23, 1959, there was an unspoken understanding among inmates. White prisoners could harass black prisoners with minimal consequences. Not always, not everywhere, but enough that it created a climate of fear. Guards looked the other way. The system protected the aggressors, and the victims had no real recourse except to endure it or risk making things worse. Bumpy's response shattered that understanding, because he didn't just defend himself. He proved that the system could be challenged, that respect could be demanded, not just hoped for, that a man with intelligence, patience, and timing could shift the balance of power even inside the most controlled environment in America. The black inmates felt it first. They walked differently, held their heads higher, spoke with more confidence, not because they suddenly thought they were invincible, but because they'd seen proof that standing up to a bully didn't have to end in defeat. One inmate, a guy named Jerome who'd been on the Rock for 6 years, put it simply during a conversation in the yard. Before Bumpy did what he did, we all just accepted it. Thought that's how it was. But now we know it doesn't have to be that way. The white inmates felt it too. Not all of them had agreed with Polson's behavior. Some had found it embarrassing. Others had stayed silent because speaking up felt too risky. But after the cafeteria incident, those inmates started distancing themselves from the overtly racist ones. Tables that used to be divided strictly by race started mixing just a little. Conversations that never would have happened before started taking place. It wasn't a revolution. Alcatraz didn't suddenly become a utopia of racial harmony, but the fear that had kept people silent, that started to crack. Polson's fall was swift and absolute. Within 2 weeks, he'd gone from one of the most feared inmates on the Rock to a cautionary tale. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. Nobody wanted to be seen sitting at his table or talking to him in the yard, because aligning yourself with Polson now meant aligning yourself with failure. He tried to rebuild his reputation once. About 3 weeks after the fight, he attempted to intimidate a younger white inmate, someone he thought would be an easy target. The kid didn't back down. He looked Polson dead in the eye and said, "You want to end up like you did with Bumpy? Keep talking." Polson walked away, and that was it. His reign was over. He spent the rest of his time at Alcatraz in obscurity. No power, no influence, no respect, just another inmate counting down the days until release. The guards noticed the change too. Violence didn't disappear, it never does in a place like Alcatraz, but the nature of it shifted. There were fewer incidents of racial harassment, fewer unprovoked attacks, fewer situations where one inmate terrorized another just because he could. Some of the guards were relieved. It made their jobs easier. Others were uncomfortable. Because the shift in power meant inmates were solving problems on their own terms, outside the official system, and that made the prison harder to control. But even the warden had to admit privately, never publicly, that what Bumpy had done might have prevented something worse. A riot, a murder, a full-scale racial conflict that could have turned the Rock into a war zone. One act of violence had stopped a cycle of it. That didn't make it right, according to the rules, but it made it effective. Bumpy himself didn't talk about what happened. He didn't brag, didn't celebrate, didn't walk around like he'd won some great victory. He just went back to his routine. Work detail in the laundry, meals in the cafeteria, walks around the yard. The same quiet, controlled presence he'd always been. But now, when he walked into a room, the respect wasn't just from a few people. It was universal. Black inmates nodded when he passed. White inmates stepped aside without being asked. Even the guards treated him differently, not with fear, but with a kind of cautious acknowledgement. Bumpy Johnson had become more than an inmate. He'd become a symbol of resistance, of dignity, of what happened when you pushed a man too far. And inside Alcatraz, a place designed to break men, to strip them of identity and power, that symbol mattered. It reminded everyone that even in the most controlled environment in the world, respect couldn't be taken. It had to be earned. And once earned, it couldn't be easily destroyed. Bumpy had earned his, and the shockwave from that one moment in the cafeteria would be felt on the rock for years to come, not because of brutality, but because of control, timing, and purpose. Bumpy Johnson served the rest of his sentence at Alcatraz without major incident. After October 23, 1959, nobody tested him again, not because they were afraid he'd attack them, but because they understood what that moment in the cafeteria had proven. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man who acted out of anger or ego. He acted out of principle, and that made him more dangerous than any bully could ever be. He spent his days the same way he always had, working in the laundry, walking the yard, reading in his cell, keeping to himself but always aware of everything happening around him. The younger inmates sought his advice. The older ones respected his silence. Even the guards, who'd seen thousands of men pass through Alcatraz, recognized that Bumpy was different. He wasn't just surviving his sentence. He was mastering it. In 1963, after serving 10 years on the Rock, Bumpy Johnson was released. He walked out of Alcatraz the same way he'd walked in, with quiet dignity and a reputation that preceded him. He returned to Harlem, to the streets he'd once controlled, and found a world that had changed in his absence. The Italian mob had tightened its grip on the drug trade. A new generation of criminals had risen. The old power structures were crumbling, but Bumpy adapted. He always did. He reconnected with old allies, built new relationships, and for the next 5 years, he remained a significant figure in Harlem's underworld, not as dominant as he'd once been, but still respected, still influential, still Bumpy Johnson. On July 7, 1968, at the age of 62, Bumpy collapsed in a restaurant in Harlem. Heart attack. He died before the ambulance arrived. The streets mourned him, not because he was a saint, he wasn't, but because he represented something rare in that world. A man who had power but didn't abuse it. A man who was feared but also respected. A man who understood that true strength wasn't about how much damage you could do, but about knowing when to act and when to wait. Decades later, the story of what happened in the Alcatraz cafeteria is still told. Not in history books, not in official records, but in the conversations of people who understand what it meant. Because that moment wasn't just about one fight between two men. It was about standing up when standing up mattered. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. It was about proving that even in the most oppressive system, dignity could be defended. Bumpy Johnson spent weeks being harassed, humiliated, and tested by a man who thought his size and his hate made him untouchable. And Bumpy waited. He didn't act out of pride. He didn't act out of rage. He acted when the harassment stopped being personal and started threatening someone vulnerable. That's what made the moment legendary. Not the violence, not the blood, not the broken bones, but the reason behind it. Because in a world where power is often abused, where bullies thrive because good people stay silent, Bumpy Johnson proved that silence has its limits. And when those limits are crossed, action isn't just justified, it's necessary. The lesson: there's a reason this story still resonates. It's not because we glorify violence, it's because we recognize the truth in it. Sometimes, patience isn't weakness, it's strategy. Sometimes, waiting isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing until the moment demands everything. Bumpy Johnson understood that. He understood that reputation isn't built on how many fights you start, but on how you finish the ones that matter. He understood that respect isn't demanded through fear, but earned through consistency, intelligence, and knowing when to stand your ground. And he understood that protecting the vulnerable isn't optional. It's what separates a man of principle from a man of ego. On October 23, 1959, in the cafeteria of the most feared prison in America, Bumpy Johnson didn't just win a fight. He ended a cycle of terror. He shifted the balance of power. And he reminded everyone watching that even on the Rock, where escape was impossible and hope was scarce, one man with courage, timing, and purpose could change everything. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories deserve to be told. Let me know in the comments, have you ever heard of Bumpy Johnson before this? What other untold stories should I cover? Because history isn't just about the famous battles or the well-known heroes. It's about moments like this. Moments when ordinary people, or in Bumpy's case, extraordinary people in impossible situations, decide that enough is enough. And they do something about it. That's the legacy of Bumpy Johnson. Not just a gangster, not just a convict, but a man who understood that power without principle is just tyranny, and that sometimes the most important fight you'll ever have is the one you didn't want but couldn't avoid. Rest in power, Bumpy Johnson. Your story lives on.